Hello, Pack. Tonight begins with a bond breaking in the middle of a ceremony that was supposed to be about something else entirely. Mara didn't know she was carrying his children yet. She only knew that she was standing in the great hall of Ashford Keep, wearing borrowed silver, watching the man she was bound to by blood and bone and every involuntary thing her body had ever done, watching him speak another woman's name into the firelight. She felt it before she understood it. The bond didn't wait for comprehension. It tore. By the time the echo of that name faded from the stone walls, Mara was already deciding. By morning, she was gone. He would spend 3 years trying to find her. He wouldn't be the only one looking. Let's begin. The ceremony had been called for the winter solstice, which was the kind of detail Mara had filed away without sentiment. Ashford Keep observed its traditions with the particular gravity of a pack that had survived long enough to believe its customs were what had kept it alive. Torches in iron brackets. The great hall dressed in pine boughs and ash-gray ribbon. The entire pack assembled in rows, breath misting in the coal that seeped through the stone no matter how many fires were lit. Mara had been in the keep for 4 months by then. She had arrived in early autumn as a translator. The council had needed someone who read Old Meridian, and she read it better than anyone within 3 territories. She had come with a leather satchel, a letter of introduction, and the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who had learned early that depending on a place to feel like home was an invitation to disappointment. She had not come expecting anything to happen to her. The bond had announced itself on the second day. She had been in the scriptorium when he walked in. Alpha King Calder of Ashford, broad through the shoulders, moving through the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. She had been reaching for a manuscript on the upper shelf. He had stopped in the doorway, and something in the air between them had gone absolutely, electrically still. She hadn't known what it was at first. She had catalogued it the way she catalogued everything. The sudden awareness of her own heartbeat, the way the room seemed to reorganize itself around his position, the fact that her hand had stopped moving toward the shelf without her instructing it to. She had filed it under anomaly and gone back to work. He had stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Then he had left without speaking. She learned what it was on the 3rd day, when she watched a pack elder bow to her in the corridor. Not a greeting bow, something deeper, something involuntary. And then look immediately embarrassed about it. She learned what it was when the kitchen wolves went quiet when she entered, and then resumed their conversation in lower voices. She learned what it was when she caught Calder watching her from across the great hall with an expression that was not quite readable, but was absolutely not casual. She went to the pack records that night and read about faded bonds until the candle burned down to nothing. She did not go to him. She told herself this was professional discretion. She was there to translate documents, not to complicate the political architecture of a pack that had enough complications already. She was a guest. He was a king. She filed the bond under problems she would address when the work was done and returned to the manuscripts. The work took longer than expected. The manuscripts were extensive. She told herself she was not prolonging the engagement deliberately. She was not entirely convincing. The 4 months had a texture to them that she would remember later in specific sensory detail rather than as a coherent narrative. The smell of peat smoke and old vellum, the particular quality of light in the scriptorium at midday when it came through the high windows and caught the dust in the air, the sound of the keep settling at night around her. And Calder, always at a careful distance, always with that expression she couldn't fully read. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in 4 months. Every conversation had been about the work. Every conversation had carried the weight of everything neither of them was saying. Once she had been working late, and she had heard footsteps stop outside the scriptorium door. She had held very still. The footsteps had not knocked. After a long moment, they had moved on. She had sat with the silence after that for longer than she would admit. She had told herself, in the careful internal language she used to manage things she wasn't ready to examine, there is time. There is time to address this properly when the work is done, when the season turns, when she has thought through what she actually wants from a situation as complicated as this one. She had told herself she was being sensible. She had been standing in the great hall in borrowed silver when she understood that there had not, in fact, been time. The ceremony was a formal one, the kind Ashford held to mark the solstice, to renew oaths, to announce alliances. She had understood it as administrative. She had not understood until Calder walked to the center of the hall and the room went absolutely quiet, that it was also the kind of ceremony where an alpha king could name a mate before witnesses and have it be binding. She understood it when he opened his mouth. She understood it when he said a name that was not hers. Isolde, the daughter of the Westmark Alpha, smooth-faced and carefully arranged in white at the front of the hall, who had been at the keep for 2 weeks, and whom Mara had registered as a political visitor and nothing more. Isolde, whose name now hung in the firelit air of the great hall with the weight of something irrevocable. The bond didn't wait for her to process it. It reacted. The sensation was not metaphorical. It was a tearing, located specifically in the center of her chest, radiating outward, a sound in her mind like something structural giving way. She felt her hand move to her sternum without deciding to move it. She felt her breath leave her body in a single controlled exhale that cost her more than she showed. Around her, the pack was still, reverent, witnesses to a declaration that was reshaping the political landscape of 3 territories. No one was looking at her. She was grateful for that. She stood through the rest of it. She did not know afterward how long it lasted. She was aware of the sound of formal words being spoken, of Isolde's composed acceptance, of the pack's collective murmur of acknowledgement. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had gone strange and uneven, and of the specific effort required to keep her face neutral and her posture straight. She was good at that. She had been good at that for a long time. She slipped out during the reception, when the hall had filled with conversation and movement, and no one was counting heads. She went to her room. She packed with the efficiency of someone who had always known she might need to leave quickly, which was not a thought she had consciously entertained in Ashford, but her hands knew the sequence anyway. Satchel, documents, the warmest cloak, boots that would hold in snow. She left the borrowed silver folded on the bed with the precision of someone making a point without words. She left one thing on the table. The dried winter sprig she had found pressed inside one of the oldest manuscripts, which she had kept without entirely knowing why. She left it there. She didn't examine why. She went out through the kitchen passage, which she had learned in her first week because she always learned the secondary exits. The kitchen wolves were at the feast. The passage was empty. The back gate was unlocked. The night was cold and clear, frost on the stone, stars hard and bright overhead. She walked north. She severed the bond at the tree line. She had read enough to know how the female leads one domain of absolute authority, the pack records had said, though they had said it in older language. She stopped walking. She stood in the dark at the edge of the Ashford forest, and she did the thing that felt like going deliberately deaf in a room that had always been full of sound. The silence afterward was enormous. She stood in it for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she walked into the trees. Miles behind her, in the great hall of Ashford Keep, Alpha King Calder went still in the middle of a conversation he had not been fully present for anyway. His hand, which had been holding a cup, stopped moving. Something crossed his face that the people nearest him would describe later, variously, as pain, shock, and the particular expression of a man who has just understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, that he has made an irreversible mistake. He set the cup down. He turned toward the door. He was already too late. 3 months passed. She covered distance the way she covered everything, methodically, without drama, one day at a time. She crossed 2 territorial borders and 1 mountain range and arrived in the Lynden Valley in early spring, which was a territory governed by a king named Aldrich, who had a reputation for precision, a council that ran on documentation, and a chronic shortage of people who could read Old Meridian. She had a letter of introduction. She had always been good at letters of introduction. Aldrich of Lynden was not what she had expected, though she had not expected much. He was quieter than Calder, his authority less physical and more administrative, the kind of king who governed through systems rather than presence. He had looked at her letter, looked at her, and said, "I have 3 years of backlogged treaty documents and a scriptorium that smells like mold. If you can fix the second problem while addressing the first, the position is yours." She had said, "I'll need better candles." He had said, "Done." She had stayed. She learned she was carrying twins in her 2nd month in Lynden. She sat with that information for a long time, in the scriptorium with the better candles burning around her, and she did the particular kind of thinking that has no words for it, only a sequence of realizations arriving one after another like stones dropping into still water. Then she went to Aldrich and told him the truth, because she had decided in the forest at the Ashford tree line that she was done managing things in silence. He had listened without interrupting. Then he had said, in the careful, precise way he said most things, "You are under Lynden protection, both of you, all of you, as it turns out." She had held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He had nodded once and gone back to his documents, and that had been that. The twins arrived in autumn, a boy and a girl, both with gray eyes that she recognized immediately and did not comment on. Imre for the boy, Senna for the girl. She raised them in a stone cottage at the edge of the Lynden scriptorium complex, which was not the life she had imagined, and was, she found, sufficient in ways she hadn't anticipated. Aldrich was a steady presence, not romantic, not claiming, simply present in the way of someone who had decided she was worth protecting and saw no reason to complicate that with anything more. The children grew. They were, both of them, unnervingly perceptive. 3 years passed. The first sign came on a morning in early spring when Senna looked up from her breakfast and said, without preamble, "There are wolves at the tree line." Mara set down her cup. How many? Senna considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old who had been raised to think before speaking. 4, maybe 5. They've been there since yesterday. Mara went to the window. She could see the tree line from the cottage. She could not see the wolves, but she could feel the quality of the air, which had changed overnight in a way she recognized and had not felt in 3 years. She went to Aldrich. He already knew. He was standing at his own window when she arrived, hands clasped behind his back, looking toward the northern border with an expression that was thoughtful and not particularly surprised. "Ashford's trackers," he said without turning around. "They've been working their way south for 2 months. I've been watching them." She stood in the doorway. "What do you want to do?" He turned then and looked at her with the particular directness she had come to appreciate in him. "That depends on what you want to do." She thought about it. She thought about the tree line and the severed bond and the 3 years of silence in the stone cottage and the children with their gray eyes. She thought about borrowed silver and a dried winter sprig left on a table and footsteps that had stopped outside a door and not knocked. "I'm not running again," she said. He nodded. "Then we received them formally." The Ashford trackers arrived the next morning. 4 of them, lean and travel-worn, wearing Ashford colors that Mara recognized with a physical jolt she did not show. They presented themselves at the Lynden gate with formal courtesy and a sealed letter bearing Calder's mark. Aldrich received them in the great hall. Mara stood at his right hand, which was a position she had not been asked to take, but which Aldrich had indicated with a small gesture that she had understood immediately. The children were with the nursemaid. She had considered bringing them and decided against it. There would be time for that. The letter was addressed to Aldrich, not to her. It was formal, political, careful, the kind of language that said nothing directly and everything obliquely. A request for diplomatic contact, a desire to discuss matters of mutual concern. The particular phrasing of a king who was trying to approach something without appearing to approach it. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table with a precise, controlled movement and said, "Tell your king that Lynden receives diplomatic visitors on Tuesdays." The lead tracker held her gaze. "He knows you're here." "I know he knows," she said. "Tuesday." The trackers left. Aldrich waited until the hall was empty, then said without inflection, "Tuesday is 4 days away." "Yes," she said. He nodded. "I'll have the formal rooms prepared." She went back to the cottage. She sat at the table where she had done 3 years of translation work with a child on each knee, and sometimes both, and she looked at the candle burning in the center of the table, and she did not count things. She had stopped counting things somewhere in the 2nd year. She wasn't sure exactly when. Calder arrived on Tuesday. He came with a small formal escort, 6 wolves, 2 council representatives, and the particular quality of someone who had rehearsed this and knew the rehearsal was useless. She was in the Lynden Great Hall when he walked in. She had positioned herself deliberately, standing, not sitting, to the left of Aldrich's chair, which was occupied, which meant Calder had to address Aldrich first and work his way to her. She watched him do it. He was thinner than she remembered, which she noted and filed. The 3 years had not been kind to him in the specific way that years spent looking for something tend not to be kind. He moved through the formal greeting with the controlled precision she recognized. Flat voice, measured words, nothing wasted. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. Then his eyes found her, and for a moment the control slipped. Not much, just a fraction. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, something more careful than relief. She held his gaze. She did not help him. Aldrich said, "I believe you know my head of translation." Calder said, "Yes." Then, after a pause that cost him something, "It's good to see you, Mara." She said, "You've had a long journey. We've arranged rooms." She watched him absorb the precision of that, the hospitality that was also a wall, the courtesy that was also a distance. He absorbed it without expression, which she had expected. He had always been good at absorbing things without expression. The formal dinner that evening was a careful exercise in diplomatic surface. Aldrich was gracious and precise. Calder's council representatives were smooth and careful. Mara sat at the table and translated a disputed passage of treaty language when called upon, and otherwise watched Calder from across the table with the same observational attention she gave to manuscripts that were not yet yielding their meaning. He ate very little. He looked at her more than was strictly necessary for diplomatic purposes. She had known he would come eventually. She had spent 3 years knowing it in the way you know something you are not ready to address. Present, constant, filed under later. Later had arrived. She was not afraid of it. She was, she acknowledged privately, somewhere between braced and ready, which were not the same thing. After dinner, when Aldrich had excused himself and the council representatives had retreated and the hall had emptied to the particular quiet of a house that is still full of people, but no longer performing. She found Calder standing at the window at the end of the corridor. She had not gone looking for him. She had simply been walking to the scriptorium, which was where she went when she needed to think, and he had been standing at that window, and the corridor was not large. She stopped. He turned. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that had been accumulating for 3 years and was now in the room with them, taking up space. She said, "You have something to say." He said, "Several things." She said, "Then say them." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had not let herself think about directly for 3 years, and that were, she noted, quieter than she remembered. The quietness of something that had been through a great deal and come out the other side, still standing, but changed. He said, "The ceremony was political, the Westmark Alliance. My council had been building toward it for 2 years, and He stopped. He started again. "I told myself the bond was manageable, that I could handle it separately, after, that there was time." She recognized those words. She had used them herself in the months before the ceremony. She did not say this. He said, "I was wrong." She said, "Yes." The word landed between them. He received it without flinching, which she noted. He said, "I realized what I had done approximately 40 seconds after you severed the bond. I want you to know that. Not as an excuse, as a fact." She held his gaze. 40 seconds. He said, "The trackers were out by morning. He paused again. His jaw tightened. "You covered your trail well," she said. "I had to." He said, "I know." Another silence. She watched him decide something, watched the decision move through him in the way decisions move through people who were not accustomed to uncertainty. He said, "Isolde and I did not complete the bonding. The alliance was restructured. It took 8 months and significant political cost, and the council was—" He stopped. "None of that is the point." She said, "What is the point?" He said, "I need to know if there's anything left. Of the bond. If it's possible to." She said, "There are 2 things you should know." He waited. She said, "The first is that I severed it deliberately at the tree line, the night I left. So whatever you've been feeling for 3 years, it wasn't the bond. It was something else." He absorbed this. She watched it land. She said, "The second thing is that you have a son and a daughter. They are 3 years old. They have your eyes." The corridor was very quiet. He stood very still. The stillness of someone who has just received information that is reorganizing everything, all at once, in real time. She watched it happen. She did not look away. He said finally, in a voice that was lower than his usual register, "Where are they?" She said, "Asleep. They go to bed at 7. He said, "Mara," she said, "I'm not finished. You asked if there's anything left. I'm going to answer that honestly, because I'm done managing things in silence. And I think you've earned an honest answer, even if you haven't yet earned everything else." He waited. He was very good at waiting when he understood that waiting was required. She said, "I spent 4 months in your keep watching you be careful, watching you hold still. I spent those 4 months doing the same thing, and I told myself there was time, and then there wasn't. And I stood in your great hall and felt the bond tear, and I walked into the forest in the dark, and I severed it myself because it was the only thing I had absolute authority over, and I needed to feel like I had authority over something." She said, "And then I came here, and I built something, and it's mine. The work is mine, and the cottage is mine, and those children are mine in a way that has nothing to do with you, because I raised them alone and I made every decision alone and I did not fall apart." She said, "So when you ask if there's anything left, The answer is that I don't know. I know that I'm not the person who left. And I know that you're not the person who stood at that window in the corridor and didn't knock. And I know that whatever comes next has to be on different terms than whatever that was. He said, "What terms?" She said, "Honest ones. Starting with, I'm afraid you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for me to leave again. And I'm afraid you'll make every decision with that fear underneath it, and I'll spend my life feeling managed instead of chosen." He said, "That's a fair fear." She said, "I know it is. I'm telling you because it's true, not because I want you to argue me out of it." He said, "I'm not going to argue you out of it." She said, "Good." Another silence, different from the previous ones. This one had something in it, not resolution, not yet, but the particular quality of two people who have finally said the true things and are now in the territory that comes after. He said, "I was afraid from the moment I understood what the bond was. I had been Alpha for 6 years before you arrived, and in that time I had learned to hold everything still, and the bond was the first thing in 6 years that I couldn't hold still, and I handled that badly." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to meet them, if you'll allow it." She said, "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. They're at their best in the morning." He said, "All right." She said, "Calder." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need you to understand what you're asking for. You're not asking to resume something. You're asking to start something that has never actually existed yet. It was always managed, careful. Neither of us said anything true until tonight." He said, "I know." She said, "So we start from here." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then I'll see you at 7. She walked to the scriptorium. She sat at the table in the candlelight for a long time, not translating anything, just sitting with the particular quality of a silence that has stopped being empty. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid and more honest than hopeful. She was, she thought, present, which was different from braced, which was, she was fairly certain, progress. The morning was cold, frost on the stone, the kind of early spring light that is honest about how much work is still left to do. Calder arrived at the cottage at exactly 7 o'clock. She opened the door before he knocked because she had heard him coming and had decided not to make him stand on the threshold longer than necessary. He looked at the children. Imre was eating porridge with the focused intensity of a 3-year-old who takes breakfast seriously. Senna was watching the door with the particular alertness she had been born with, which Mara had always privately attributed to the gray eyes, though she knew that wasn't scientific. Senna said without preamble, "You were looking for us." Calder said, carefully, "Yes." Senna considered this. "That's a long time to look for something." Calder said, "It is." Imre looked up from his porridge. "Are you staying for breakfast?" Calder looked at Mara. Mara looked at Calder. Something passed between them. Not the bond, which was severed and silent, but something else. Something that had been built in the corridor last night from honest words, and was still standing in the morning light, which was the more important test. She said, "There's porridge." He said, "Then yes." He sat at the table. Senna immediately began explaining to him, with great seriousness, the correct ratio of honey to porridge, which was apparently a matter of some importance. Imre went back to eating. Calder listened to Senna with the focused attention of someone who understood that this was not a small thing, that sitting at this table was an enormous thing, and that the appropriate response to enormous things was to be very still and very present, and to not waste a single moment of them. Mara poured tea. She set a cup in front of him. He looked up at her, gray eyes, quieter than she had ever seen them, the particular quietness of something that has finally, after a very long time, stopped bracing. She sat down. The morning light came through the window and fell across the table, across the porridge and the honey, and the two small people who had her stubbornness and his eyes, and for a while no one said anything important, and everything was said anyway. 3 weeks later, in the Lynden Great Hall, with Aldrich as formal witness, and the Lynden Council in attendance, and a pair of 3-year-olds in the front row who were taking the proceedings with varying degrees of gravity, Senna solemn and attentive, Imre more interested in the candles. Calder of Ashford spoke her name before witnesses. Not a political declaration, not a ceremony of alliance. The words were old ones, from the pack records she had once read by candlelight in the Ashford scriptorium on a night when she was trying to understand what was happening to her. The words that named a bond. That made a private truth a public fact. He said her name. He said what she was to him. He said it flat and final, the way he said everything that mattered, each word set down with the weight of something that had been examined thoroughly before being offered. The Lynden wolves went quiet in the particular way she recognized, the collective stillness of a pack that has just witnessed something involuntary and true. Senna, in the front row, nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already known. Imre said, at a volume that was not quite a whisper, "Is that it? Can we have the cake now?" Mara held Calder's gaze. She held it for a moment that was too long and too short at the same time. Then she said, quietly, so only he could hear, "Before you crossed the courtyard, when the gate opened. That's when I knew." He said, "For me it was the scriptorium. Second day. You were reaching for a shelf." She said, "You didn't say anything." He said, "Neither did you." She said, "We were both very stupid." He said, and there was something in his voice that was almost a smile, the closest thing to one she had seen from him in all of it. "Yes." She said, "Don't do it again." He said, "No." The cake, it turned out, was excellent. Imre had 2 pieces. Senna had 1.5, and then reconsidered and had the other half. Calder sat at the table in the Lynden Great Hall with a child on each side of him and ate cake with the particular focused attention of someone who understands that this is not a small thing, that this is, in fact, the thing. Mara watched him. She filed it away. She did not count anything. She was done counting. Pack, a king who spent 6 years holding everything perfectly still and 3 years learning what it cost him. A woman who walked into a forest in the dark and built something real from nothing and made him earn his way back to the table. Here's what I want to know. Did she make him wait long enough? Or did the porridge and the honest words in the corridor earn him more than he deserved? Tell me in the comments. Was this earned, or was she too generous? And if you've ever built something from nothing after someone let you walk away, this one's for you. Share it with someone who needs a good love story tonight. Until next time, Pack, take care of each other.